Hey everybody, welcome back to Backlog Banter. I'm your boy Abram, joined as always by Mr. Tucker Hazel, and today we're here to talk about our favorite thing in the world, and that is gambling. We love to gamble.
Yay!
Uh,
Yay!
and right now, the whole gaming community is gambling on who is going to win Game of the Year at Jeff Keighley's newest TGA event, which is in just a couple days of the time of you watching this video. And there's a very interesting nominee this year for Game of the Year, and that is Local Thunk's Balatro, which stands out from the other nominees in a number of ways that we're going to discuss. And to Tucker's mind, sort of encapsulates the year that is 2024, perhaps even better than any of its competitors. So we wanted to sit down today, talk a little bit about Balatro, about its chances at the Game Awards, but sort of, I think most importantly, kind of how Balatro encapsulates and exemplifies the sort of current culture, development culture, and playing culture in the larger game space.
Yeah.
So Tucker, this is really your concept. This game is your child. Well, really, it's
Yeah, I
Local
made it,
Thunk's child, but if you're like the godfather of it, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, look, making a game or making a baby is a two-person
Exactly.
enterprise, as far as I'm concerned. So maybe I'm the other person. Who knows?
More than two people played this game though, Tucker, because it sold what? Like how many? It sold millions of copies.
I don't know. Yeah, I actually don't know if there's a confirmed
50 million
Balatro sales
copies, I
number.
think.
That can't be right.
No, it's not.
No. Balatro sales numbers, as of August 2, 2024, 2 million copies. You'd assume it's 2.5 or something right now.
You know,
if not even 3.
Even if it's not any higher than 2 million, that is still like set yourself up for life type of money, because this is a Tucker, largely solo developed game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is where a lot of the intrigue around Balatro comes from.
Yeah.
Ultimately, when you're putting this game up against FromSoft, you're putting this game up against Atlas, up against GSC Game World.
No.
Did they do
What are you
Stalker?
talking about?
I get them confused with...
Yeah, Stalker. No, GSC
Game
did Stalker.
Science is who made it.
Game Science.
Game Science made Black Myth.
Wukong. Yeah, and also in competition with Square Enix and Sony. Like, these are some of the biggest studios working in the business. And you're right, Balatro stands out from many regards. But I would say it being a solo dev or indie game is, in my mind, one of the less important elements of like what makes it distinct. Because what really makes Balatro distinct and stand out, not only from the lineup this year, which is almost all third-person action games,
right?
But is also also from the entire history of the Game Awards, which is largely dominated by third-person action games, is that this is a card game.
Yeah,
and that's the first time a card game has been nominated for a major award in this way in the history of the medium. And so, just from like a single screenshot, it sets itself apart just by genre, and it expands sort of what people see as. And I think that's why this game is so challenging to the current Game Awards or awards space market, because just the simple genre of this being a card game immediately challenges what our preconceived notions of a Game of the Award nominated or winning game could be.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the reason I was thinking about the input is that we had a discussion much earlier this year about sort of your idea of zeitgeist games and how a lot of this year's how about most relevant in for want of a better term, most relevant games are from not your top of the line developers, many of whom are sort of in their refractory periods ahead of very big releases next year from your Rockstars, Nintendo's marquee teams, etc. And so I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. But your point about it being a card game about genre is also very important, because I saw a YouTube short yesterday from a guy named Luke Stevens, who I think has never had a good opinion in his life. But I'm not trying...
I think I've probably come across his videos once or twice. I have no feelings on the guy whatsoever. Luke, if you're watching this is an Abram problem, not me.
I actually don't even really have a problem with him. Actually, that's not true. Luke, I'm sure you're a very nice man. That's what I'll say. I'm sure you're a very nice man.
Sure.
He is making...
In this video...
He is making this interesting point that, in his view, a game like Balatro is not eligible for Game of the Year or shouldn't be in consideration for the award because it doesn't succeed across a wide spread of creative and technical aspects. As he says,
Okay.
it's a game that is very good at what it does,
Yeah.
but doesn't do a lot. He then later in that video says that Pal World should have been nominated.
Interesting. Okay.
But we'll put Pal World to the side. I think that Balatro is illustrative of the fact that this idea is simply untrue.
Yeah.
Because what's so cool about Balatro, why it being the vision of one person is important, is that the notion of it being a card game, it's not even a card game in the way that like Hearthstone is a card game, or
Yeah.
like Slay the Spire or whatever. This literally is just a heightened roguelike take on playing poker.
Yes.
It
With like a deck of bicycle playing cards.
Yeah, and so it's quite compelling that through the vision of this one guy, we got a very new approach to almost an entirely oversaturated genre in the roguelike.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, roguelike, absolutely. But I think for me, what's even more surprising is that I don't know if you can say oversaturated, but how about forever saturated? The idea of what can we do with playing cards
Yeah.
is something that has been around for hundreds of years, and people are always coming up with new ways to play with cards. But I think what's so interesting and exciting to me about Balatro, because I'm not a playing card guy, I've never really cared for Go Fish or War, like but those are genuine examples.
that's
Come on,
true.
I'm not
That's
I'm not
true.
a Go Fish guy, but but is that I think it combines the strengths of what so many people have found so compelling about poker for so long, and combines it with the fact that this is a video game. This could not be done with actual cards in the way that it is. But it combines those two really well to where it feels like a foundational thing in my mind. Like, this is a roguelike or puzzle game in the way that Tetris is a puzzle game, in the way that, like, that these foundational, simple games are. Balatro feels like another one of those, which I think is why it's glued. It's had so many people glued to it for this entire year.
Yeah.
Because it does feel like it's just out there and it is what it is, and people are going to be playing this for years to
I
come.
mean, to the point about the cultural conversation, I don't think many games have stuck in it the way that the Balatro has, at least for our in-group. And then it's been intriguing to see in the recent weeks, in light of its nominations, and it has many nominations, and wins at other awards bodies, as an important note. It's been interesting to see it sort of proliferate out to more people, and to, if I remember correctly, unseat Minecraft Pocket Edition as the #1 paid game on the App Store for something nuts, like the first time, or it was some ridiculous stat about the extent to which Minecraft Pocket Edition was dominant on mobile platforms prior to Balatro. And I think it's interesting to try to look at why from sort of a design perspective, because I played Balatro a fair bit. I don't like it, but that's a very personal thing. I mean, I look at this game and I think it's compelling because it is, as you're saying, a sort of a familiar language in cards and poker, but this very particular new dopamine releasing multiplication element.
Yeah.
But it is also in some ways like a turn-based RPG, is the way I was thinking about it in a lot of ways.
Interesting. Okay.
You're essentially building a party, and you're doing damage, and between these battles, you're raising your stats. It's a stat-based game, and so I think it's working on this subconscious level to hide these tropes and hooks that players have loved for generations in RPGs, of raising your stats, of simply getting the big number.
Yeah, I mean, that's an arcade high score sort of thing that not many not many games that get nominated for Game of the Year have that sort of appeal.
Yeah, I think it's a very cleverly assembled game. It just so happens that all of the clever elements are all elements that I almost unilaterally dislike. I love a number. I love a ton of high score games, but I think that Balatro is testament to the fact that you can really captivate people without a lot of the bells and whistles that
Yeah.
define the biggest games of a year. And obviously, we know this. Obviously, a lot of people in our audience know it. But I think that the benefit of Balatro being nominated is that it's illustrative of the fact that the the biggest games of the year, the ones that are the most relevant in a year,
Yeah.
aren't the most expensive, aren't the most archetypal.
Absolutely.
And even when you look at indie nominees of past years, you're looking at things like a Hades. You're looking at things like,
Yeah.
well, It Takes Two doesn't really count because it's an EA game.
No, I think this is important to note because we talk a
Yeah.
lot about genre, and I certainly
Yeah.
want to get back to that. But we started by mentioning that this is an independently developed and published game. This is
Yeah.
a small team, they're very, very tight, even with like the publishing group that is distributing the game to things like mobile and other platforms. This is not even like Devolver or Annapurna. Like we're not even reaching that level. And just looking back at the history of the Game Awards nominees, the first game that you could make the argument was an indie nominee, I think, would be Journey. Though that was published by Sony, and so there's a little bit of an ifs, ands, or buts there. But obviously, in some spirit, that's one of the games that people think of as an indie game, especially for that time. And then it isn't until Inside in 2016, Celeste in 2018, Hades in 2020, and Stray in 2022. Like these are every couple years we get something that can be argued in a couple of directions, but it's very rare. Which I'm excited to see something especially like Balatro that is very outside the norm of visual style, gameplay, structure that Game Awards nominees usually do. Like there's not even any voice acting, like there's not a story, which all these other games have. Celeste has an emotional story. Hades has great voice acting. Journey is an immensely emotional game. But Balatro is literally just boiled down video game appeal, but you can draw back to RPGs and to arcade games and to puzzle games that are just about that kinetic, really tightly focused gameplay loop. That's what Balatro really exemplifies for me, is the enduring appeal of the gameplay loop.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that it's just interesting to see a lot of the ire pointed towards this game online. Again, in a niche bubble, but in the discussion around the 6 nominees, because I think that it's just a shame that a game like this can't be championed as perhaps the most deserving, or one of the most deserving of this nomination in the first place. Because I really like what you're saying about it sort of being illustrative of these timeless concepts and being a rewarding of and an affirmation of this sort of success, this sort of enduring, cross-generational, cross the history of the medium success. It's playing all of that, and it's also putting a real challenge to a lot of its much larger, much better funded peers. And saying, as we were saying in our Zeitgeist Games video earlier this year, that the future of the medium is divergent. It's not just your Final Fantasies and your Black Myths. It's also your Balatros. And it's intriguing to think about the other games that very easily could have been up for Game of the Year or probably vying for the same quote-unquote indie slot that this got.
Yeah.
Your UFO 50s and your Animal Wells. There's a lot of real impressive momentum from these indie games right now. And it has been the case for a decade, but as we were saying earlier, and I keep saying in this video, I think people should really go check it out. There's a very unique tenor in the air right now, I think, around games like this, particularly sort of at the intersection of big AAA issues. I was even just seeing a story on Bloomberg this morning about publishers fretting and saving their 2025 release dates, waiting to see if GTA 6 is going to get delayed again.
Yeah. Or what window that game is going to come out in,
100%. So, when you're looking at these sort of slow-moving ships, when you can be that... Yeah, when you're that little speedboat and you're going between them, I think that's very
one
compelling.
guy on a jet ski.
Exactly.
It's local funk.
And, it's not... It's probably my least favorite of the nominees, but
Yeah.
I think it is the game that if it were to win, I would be most excited about,
Yeah.
because I think that that would just be such a an important rubber stamping of
Yeah.
games of Balatro's scale, and to the point you're making before of Balatro's method of distribution, because it being a truly independent product
Yeah.
is, in my view, even more important when we are sort of uplifting the indie space as this alternative to the AAA space
Yeah.
without identifying the ways in which a lot of indie publishers, be it Devolver, Annapurna,
Yeah.
etc., who make wonderful games, still do put their creators, in various ways into similar binds as what you would find
Sure.
with a larger team, a larger AAA publisher. So to have local things say, look, this is my game. I made it. I released it. Here it is. It's probably set me up for life. Everybody loves it.
Yeah.
This is what we can do. This is the space there is in the industry for small games like mine to succeed creatively and financially. It would be a very, very exciting proposition for that to be the game of the year.
Yeah, I see it sort of in the way it like in the hypothetical world where Balatro wins Game of the Year, which I was high on like last time we did one of these videos. I've kind of come down on that a little bit. But if this game were to win, I think I would see it in a similar vein as to like Parasite winning Best Picture was, where it was sort of an outsider, a different kind of movie from a different source. Obviously, that being a foreign film, and this is being an indie game. They're slightly different beasts, but in terms of breaking conventions and breaking expectations, I think it'd be very important. I think it's important that it was nominated. Like that's the real win. But if it were to win, I think what it would signal, and I think you can draw this parallel to Parasite quite clearly, is I would not be surprised if Balatro were to win Game of the Year. I would not be surprised to, from here on forward, basically always see an indie game as one of the nominees, if not more. Because something that we saw with the Best Picture nominees since Parasite has won is that there's always been at least one foreign language nominated film, which was occasionally happened every 2 or 3 years for the Oscars Best Picture race before Parasite. But I think it's the opening of eyes thing, which I think is why when you mention who was the guy that you were talking about earlier that you have issues with?
Luke Steffens.
Luke Steffens, yes. His claim and the claim that many, I think, less informed people online have made of Balatro shouldn't be considered in this because it's not the same as these other games. It doesn't have voice acting. It doesn't have a long production cycle. It's not pushing the bounds of fidelity. It doesn't have a crazy story. It doesn't have any of these elements that we traditionally associate with one game of the year. I think it's important to have this progress be sort of chipped away at. And now, again, even like with Parasite winning, it's not an end-all be-all. Suddenly this knocks the walls down. But you have to have Balatro show up, Celeste show up, Hades show up to start to build the precedent to where eventually, I'd say, 10 years from now, we're looking at a Best Picture race that probably includes 3 or 4 foreign language nominees. And I would not be surprised if half the nominees at some point within the next decade are smaller games, are games of more diverse genre that don't fit into that exact mold that we've seen story-based, very realistic, third-person action games, long games fit into. Yeah. The game space is so much more diverse than that, and while Balatro is one of my favorite games of the series, it's not like my top 5, but the reason I championed this one is because what you were saying, it represents the diversity of the medium that, frankly, the nominees for Game of the Year don't usually represent. They're almost always great games, but when I think about the breadth of a year, I'm thinking about games from the biggest scope, like Red Dead 2, down to Celeste. I mean, like, there's this range here. And especially with games that really hook the wider audience's attention and build zeitgeist momentum and just pure word of mouth because they're interestingly designed. We saw so many games like that this year. And Balatro is maybe the ultimate example of that.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, Balatro is in my top 35 games of 2024.
Oh, nice. Out of, what, like 37?
Yes, actually. 36.
Oh, okay. Well, that's even worse.
The point you're making, I think, is a critical one, because to think about Parasite a little bit more, Bong Joon-ho had his really intriguing quote calling subtitles a 1-inch barrier.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think a lot of us...
Something you're very familiar with.
They called you
It's
in
a
high
cock
school.
joke. I don't know, man. But keep going.
A lot of us, when Parasite won and we hear this quote, we're thinking, oh yeah, what are you talking about? So, who gives a fuck? I watch subtitled films all the time. I love foreign cinema, right? But they're these sort of inflection points that illustrate and help to deprogram these biases that exist in the much more casual viewer base of a medium, right? Player base in this case. And so even though I think most of us in this conversation, and even people like Luke Steffens, are well aware of the breadth of the medium and are articulate enough to understand the great power that games like Balatro have, we got to remember that the Game Awards is among, if not the most viewed gaming live stream of the year. Mm-hmm. And so, there's a very big, very casual market that is seeing this award show. Mm-hmm. And very possibly are holding that sort of 1-inch barrier mindset about a small game like Balatro. And so if you're able to get, Joe Smith, Muhammad Smith, most common possible first and last name person in the world, is watching this show and plays COD and plays college football and maybe played Black Myth Wukong. Yeah. And is like, that's and Helldivers, and like, that's what gaming is. That, a big game like that needs to win. You that's the sort of person who likely still could need their eyes open to the power of a game like Balatro. And so I think that this notion of precedent in terms of nominee, but also in terms of widening understanding is super important. And while I maintain still that I think it's going to go to Astrobot, I really do think that Balatro is the only real competition it has, because it's captivated people for so long, and it's been so strategically handled in its post-release period. Coming from platform to platform, having those big Jimbo and Friends crossovers, gaming Cyberpunk and The Witcher and various things. It's been a very shrewdly marketed and positioned game, in addition to a very highly good game. I don't know. I
lost the plot there. No, but I understand what you're saying. I think that the momentum is strongest with Balatro, which is why a couple weeks ago when we recorded our Astra video, I was hyping myself up, like, this is why Balatro's going to win. And maybe I'm starting to hype myself up again. Maybe it's just the more I talk about nominees. But I think that you make a good point about all these updates and the fact that it's been able to keep itself in conversation. I mean, I actually think of it quite similarly to, though obviously not to the same, well, it's an interesting divide here, but I think of it very similarly to what Vampire Survivors did a couple years ago, where it was big on Xbox and PC, and then suddenly the mobile drop happens and everyone's like, oh shit, this is gonna kill my time, damn. And then it shows up in a Nintendo Direct and everyone's excited about it, and finally this year it comes to PlayStation, it's building that, and people are just continuing to talk about it. Balatro has had that same thing happen where it's immensely popular on PC, starts to come to other systems, hits mobile, everyone's like, oh my god, Balatro on mobile, and to your point earlier, it becomes one of the fastest selling games on the mobile platform, which is something that we don't see like happen very often, or at least it doesn't crack into our conversation bubble, which I think is another interesting place where this game sort of converges the more casual audience, because a lot of people play games on their phone. I mean, I'm going to be honest, I think I could probably look at all the nominees. How many games nominated for Game of the Year in the history of the Game Awards are even playable on mobile? Well, Capcom has been great at porting their Resident Evil games to iPhone, and there's like Death Stranding is on iPhone, but like it's I mean, PUBG technically, I guess that's PUBG Mobile. I don't know how different that is, to be honest. Hearthstone,
any Xbox game.
True, yeah, but I think honestly, looking at this list, I think Hearthstone in the entire history of the Game Awards until Balatro was the only game before the Game Awards, that was its popularity and identity was partially built on it being playable on mobile.
Yeah.
And so again, that's another area that's pretty rare. And you talk about the fact that people's eyes still need to be opened. What I think is interesting about the dichotomy between people on the sort of the games industry in group like us, very concerned about the breadth of the medium and all this stuff, and very aware of everything that's going on. We see Balatro getting nominated. We're like, well, yeah, I mean, everyone was talking about it, everyone being in the gaming industry circle, and it's a great game that people love. Of course, it would be nominated. And the fact that it's a card game, the fact that it's an indie game, doesn't even like cross our minds. And so, like, to us, it's like the expectation is a great game should be nominated, and Balatro is one of those. So of course, but there's also the people that do see games as, because it's what they're familiar with, as Madden, GTA, FIFA, the more actually mainstream things, that they look at a Game Awards lineup. They're like, well, no, like the big games, because those are the ones I'm familiar with, but frankly, those are the ones that have also been nominated. Those are the ones that should be nominated. And so there's frankly like two bubbles that exist, and
Yeah.
we're starting to like merge them together, which I think is important because the the hardcore gaming audience constantly gets games that they love being nominated for Game of the Year, and sometimes it's games that people don't really care about outside of that bubble. But then having Balatro be that sort of middle ground that's able to sort of bring things together of like, it is available on mobile, it is increasing in popularity, but it also exemplifies some of these traits of the hardcore in-group gaming audience. I think it's a really nice middle ground.
Yeah, I did too. And I mean, I've also, I've said this to you many times. I view Game of the Year as something kind of different than the best Game of the Year.
Yeah.
And I think that Balatro really does illustrate where we are in this moment very nicely, particularly in a slate of games that largely doesn't, is largely a lot of sequels, is largely a lot of very familiar gameplay archetypes and things, which to me is not prohibitive of nomination in any way, shape, or form, but is more so just to say that in a year which I view in large part as sort of a holding pattern for the industry in a lot of ways, I think that Balatro sort of represents the progress being made, and that progress being the continual success of this viral portion of the medium and of the development space. And so we'll see how it shakes out. Obviously, that I don't think these are really considerations that go into the vote that much. I think that if they were, I always think about in 2020 Animal Crossing versus Last of Us Part 2. Yeah. Last of Us Part 2, in my view, the best game of that year without a shadow of a doubt. Animal Crossing, in my view, the game that defined that year the most. Mm-hmm. And so,
do you think Balatro is that game for this year?
In terms of defining the year?
Yeah.
I mean, Super Monkey Ball is not nominated, so if I'm
no, okay, that's not even what I mean. I mean, like, overall, do you think Balatro might be the game that represents this year best?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can make a good case for that.
I think it's at least in the top 3, but I mean, honestly, I'm just looking at like other games that came out this year. There's a lot of big flashy stuff that kind of came and went. I think for me, it might be Balatro, Helldivers, and Wukong, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think because Astrobot also, in my view, has a very strong meta narrative about this much more nimble 60-person AAA development team working at the super high fidelity, sort of representing.
Sorry, what kind of development? AAA development? We have a video coming up about that where you say the exact opposite, but that's okay. We'll continue.
AAA and aesthetic. I'm jet lagged. I get a pass. But I think that it's not the only game with a really good narrative about sustainable development that's also highly successful and highly beloved in our space. I'd have to really think on it, but I think I would put Balatro, Helldivers, Astrobot up there, and then probably Endless Ocean, and probably Penny's Big Breakaway.
Yeah, what a surprising list there. Yeah, well, I think that kind of sums it all up. Yeah. Balatro is not a game that you love, but as a interesting part of the texture of this year and the fact that it was able to work its way up in the voting body to be nominated for Game of the Year. We've talked a little bit about its chances of winning, but mostly just what it means for this moment.
Yeah.
And what I think is so interesting, thinking about the origins of indie games and the way that things have sort of pushed forward, is that there's always a moment where something is new from a person we've never heard of before, brings in new ideas, and then becomes cemented. Of like, oh well, that's just one of the great games. Like no one looks back at like now if you like saw Shovel Knight on like a shelf, you're like, well, yeah, it's Shovel Knight. Like he's been in like 6 games and like it's crossing over with everything and sold like millions and millions of copies. Like one of the icons of the 2010s in gaming. That's that. Undertale, Stardew Valley. Like these are just some of the games of all time. And I think Balatro is, as we're talking about it now, we're crossing over into that moment where 18 months from now, we look back, we're like, well, people are still playing Balatro. It's just one of the games that just exists in the ether forever because it's a great game. But we're also in the moment now where it isn't quite that yet. It still does feel like a countercultural sort of thing that's pushing back against the pre-established norm. And it's really exciting to like feel that tension in the Game Awards, even if it does mean that there's people making arguments on like it's a card game, it's an indie game, like it should be in its own space, but we're watching that fight be fought sort of in real time.
We are, and I think I'm just trying to find the category here of indie games of the year.
Yeah.
And I can't. A Thousand X Resist, Animal Arco, Balatro. This isn't the right list.
No, Thousand X Resist and Arco were not nominated.
Fucking AI overview. I thought I could maybe get one useful piece of information out of it one time in my life.
I got it. Animal Well, Balatro, Lorelei, Neva, and UFO 50 Fucking
it's interesting.
That's a great list.
It is a great list. And, you have your usual suspects in there of Annapurna and of Devolver. But when you look at UFO 50, when you look at Animal Well, and when you look at Balatro, and if we extend this point I'm making out to games like Vampire Survivors, I think we're also seeing a very interesting sort of reclamation of a truer, in a distribution sense, truer approach to indie gaming.
Yeah.
Sort of, and this is me narrativizing a little bit, but kind of, it's interesting to put that in conversation with the push for the larger indie space to be more sort of homogenized, or to sort of quote unquote play up with bigger budgets, your Strays and your Kinas and various things that present in some ways indie but are just AA games. It's cool to see, these titles sort of resist and be the ones that are really dominant in conversation about indie gaming. And I think that's very cool. It's very cool to see these, if not solo, if not self-published, very close or very scrappily published, like in the case of Animal Well and Big Mode.
Yeah.
It more closely mirrors, I think, what indie meant a decade and change ago. And so sure. I think it's a cool thing to sort of track as we're moving forward, as this sort of new group of indie games, I think, becomes canonized in people's minds.
Totally.
Sort of this decade's crew of Meat Boy, Braid, Fez, Shovel Knight. I think that crew is building with Balatro 100%. And Vampire Survivors and others of the ilk, which are truly, once again, quite indie in their production context. So that's just another interesting part of the larger Balatro conversation, I feel. But it is cool that, it's not that it's a game that looks more indie or non-AAA like It Takes Two, which is a very cool game as well. But, this is properly a very scrappy project. So we'll see what happens. Either way, there's going to be a Balatro music orchestrated at the Game Awards.
Yeah. Do you like the music?
I can't be positive that I ever played with the sound on.
Oh, fair enough.
that was a big. Oh, I'm like watching Hassan.
Yeah,
I'm just gonna.
Of course, no, 100%. Yeah, I've done the same thing, absolutely. But I hope you guys enjoyed listening to this conversation about Balatro in its context of being a Game of the Year nominee at Geoff Keighley's The Game Awards. People call him Geoff a lot. I think they should.
Hey everybody, hold on. I forgot to swallow.
It's the first time for everything.
Yeah, it's not. I don't usually have that problem.